Hey, thanks for stopping by the old YouTube page. If you haven't met me yet, my name is Nick Richtsmeier, and I run a firm called CultureCraft, where we do high-level business strategy and transformation around the issue of trust, because trust is sort of the fundamental thing that has spent the last 40 years degrading, and most businesses have been not given the resources to solve for it, so that's what we do. We also, if you're not aware, train other leaders and other folks in how to do this through our system of trust-made growth. That's a little preamble, but I want to really just spend a quick deep dive here today on a piece from a webinar I did last week. You can get the full webinar in our free community, trustmadegrowth.com. But I want to hit the specific point at the beginning that got some feedback, and I thought it'd be worthwhile for us to talk about for just a few minutes. I'm going to try and keep this super brief, and that's the issue of reality. I've been doing just a brief deep dive on reality. No, one of the questions I get a lot is, why is it so hard for trust? And what does it have to do with the internet and platforms and enshittification and all these things that we talk about in lots of different venues? Because one of the things I think there's a lot of fear about is that if we take trust seriously, then we have to suddenly become like an analog business and start sending every opportunity through the mail, or put flyers on people's windshields, or start having sort of steak dinners at the, at the American Legion or something. And maybe you should do that. Just as a side point, maybe a steak dinner at the American Legion would actually be very successful. But what I wanted to do just briefly, that I did not get to spend as much time as I wanted to on the webinar call, is to really start to connect these dots as to why the shift in our digital environment has had such an impact on trust, and how you need to think about that as a leader, as a person trying to grow a venture, as a person trying to have an impact, as a person trying to attract talent, whatever you're trying to do, through the lens of the digital reality, and why that's significantly more challenging than it used to be. We're going to use a phrase that's infamous in the tech world that started with, I believe, Steve Jobs, or maybe as a precursor, but it's most famous from Steve Jobs. And that's the framing of the reality distortion field. That Steve was infamous for. It didn't really matter what was true, that if Steve believed it was true, he could sort of distort reality to the point where what he envisioned could come into being. Now, of course, that's a lot of mythology that it doesn't hold water in the end, which is very true of the Steve Jobs mythos. But the concept of reality distortion fields has certainly held sway in Silicon Valley, and you see leaders today who are trying to do their best Steve Jobs cosplay. Elon Musk, of course, is a great example, and others who are trying to show their ability to distort reality simply by force of personality. That's not the kind of reality distortion field I want to talk about today. The reality shift that I want to talk about today has everything to do with why it's so hard to connect, because we are dealing with so many layers of distortion, and what that's doing to trust. And why it forces every leader to dramatically change how they think about communication, about engagement, about positioning, about messaging, about even product design, service and model design, offering design, to really get to the issues around trust. So what you see here is what I refer to as the 6-layer dip, right? If you're from the Midwest, as I am, you know what a real 7-layer dip is, but we'll call this the 7-layer dip. And that is the 7 layers of everybody's digital experience. So unless you're sitting in a room talking to someone, probably if you're on the phone, maybe if you're on a Zoom call, right, you're freed from the bulk of this distortion. But as soon as we're engaging through digital spaces, we've got to deal with all of this stuff. So the first layer, the thing that makes us human and the thing that makes us able to connect and fires all the mirror neurons and all the things that make people trust and believe and make choices and engage, is the experienced level. When we go through something together, when we have a shared experience that requires very little interpretation, then there's very fast bonding, right? We're in the midst of a new Survivor season, right? They put a bunch of people on a deserted island for 20 some odd days, and they have like microwave bonding. If you've ever been a camp counselor or went to a summer camp, right? You know what this is like. This is microwave level bonding, because the experience is so sharp and so intense and so psyche breaking that there's not a lot of room for diverse interpretation. Now, there is going to be a diverse interpretation. We'll get that in a second. but there is this deep shared experience. It's one of the reasons why really intense, like high cost, high investment event marketing, like the old Dreamforce from Salesforce took off, is because if you gave people a transformational experience, there was an immediate level of shared bonding, right? Well, we have very little of that in the business climate anymore. There's less and less of it than we used to. And then, so the next layer for humans is interpret it, right? So if we have an experience, it doesn't tend to be that sharp most of the time. Most of the time, we're just sort of living life, and we kind of vaguely experience things through our lens and through our day and through our past, and et cetera. And all of those personal dynamics, the things that are within me that aren't within you, create interpretation, right? And that interpretation adds a layer of fuzz to reality. You're going to see reality a little differently than I do because you're interpreting it different because you're a different human than I am. And that alternate, quite literally alternate reality is a place where relationships are made and broken, right? When we learn to appreciate those differences in interpretation, it actually can enrich relationships, because then we don't have like echo chambers and people who just agree with each other all the time. We can go, oh, that's interesting that you see it that way. Oh, it's interesting that you see it that way. And that's the interpretation layer. Now, that interpretation layer stops, is the last stop when we just have two people engaging, right? Because they are just exchanging interpretations through whatever relationship they have. The next layer is the related layer, which is sort of like the telephone game. That now, once something goes through layers of relationship, where you heard from somebody who heard from somebody who heard from somebody, and like a referral is a telephone game. A client endorsement is a telephone game. Hey, I saw this on the internet, you should read it, is a telephone game, right? So those related things, where things are passed through another person, as another layer of distortion, right? We know that from the telephone game. I don't need to go to that into detail. Now we've taken almost all of that, all of those relationship distortions, all those interpretations, all of those diverse experiences, and then we put them on the internet and we digitize them. And we made them comply with the rules of the internet. Hyperlinks, click me's, get to certain pages, video formats versus text formats versus image formats, all of the things that are dramatic limitations of reality. We forget that the internet, as cool as it is, and even in its heyday, as cool as it was back in the day for us old guys, even at its best, the internet had dramatic rules, and today has dramatic rules that alter reality. Like, I'll give an example. I went to my son's show band. He's in the band for the show choir. And a lot of their performances we don't get to see when they're going to big contests because they're in other places. So I've seen the performance a couple times live and many times on YouTube because they're in, somewhere a few hours away at a contest. And so we had the final jamboree last week, which is they come back and they're like, okay, this is our final performance, and everything. They do the performance and everybody cries, and it's exciting. And it was overwhelming how different the experience was live since the last time I'd seen it live, but certainly since the last time I'd seen it through a YouTube screen. And we think YouTube is giving us a version of reality. You are probably watching this on YouTube as we speak, but YouTube is giving us a digitized, blurred, manufactured version of reality, right? And that is a distortion. Now, we've been living with those four layers of distortion: experienced, interpreted, related, digitized, for almost 30, 35 years. And we've gotten used to them a little bit, and we know the rules of the game a little bit, although there has been massive trust degradation through that process. Now that trust degradation is on a precipice level cliff, right? The speed of degradation is so fast because we add an algorithmic layer. The algorithmic layer says, hey, of all this digital stuff, which is an approximation of reality, let's let this machine decide what's important. And the machine's going to scan your behavior and scan what websites you click and scan what it knows about you and decide what you should think is important. Now, these things have gotten significantly more sophisticated. They're smarter than they used to be. They're better at this kind of thing. But I'll use a great example of the so-called intelligent algorithms. I went to Peacock, the streamer, the other day. I've watched a lot of, Parks and Rec, The Office, the 30 Rock, right? And the people who made those shows just came out with a brand new show, The Legend or something or other of Reggie Dinkins. Sorry, I screwed that up for the people who made that show. I'm sure it's lovely. And I was trying to find it. Well, you would think, given my history on Peacock, it would be, hey, you should watch this. And I couldn't find it. So the algorithms, as smart as they are not as smart as they could be, right? I've had similar situations in all kinds of algorithmic environments, and as have you. And so they're distorting reality now at a level of telling us what we like, what we think, what's important, what we should focus on. And now we have the artificial layer. The artificial reality is now we don't even know what's real anymore. Is it a deep fake? Has the video been altered? Has the audio been altered? Is this really even this person talking? Is it taken out of context? Right? The capacity for total inversions of truth are rampant at the artificial layer in a way that they simply weren't at any other layer. Now, in digitized, could you alter a photo? Could you do, there's some layers of manipulation there for sure. But we all know that part of the terrifying thing about the artificial layer is its ability to hallucinate. It's, again, the deep fakes and all of that kind of stuff, which are only going to increase in substance and quality. Meaning, this is really the punchline of all this, meaning that if you and I want to connect, and I want you to connect with what I'm doing over here in my business or my world or my growth, or I want to connect to what you're doing over there with the problems and needs and situation you have, I got to make a 14-layer trip. I got to have my experience, I have to interpret it, and then I have to relate it to someone who can help me find it on the internet. I got to go, or I have to find someone else's version that's been related to the internet, and then their version has been altered on the internet. It's fed to me by my algorithm who thinks it knows what I want, and I'm probably altered in some fundamental way by a summary or some other thing through an artificial layer. Then it's going to go down and search for you, and the way it's going to search for you is first through the artificial layer. It's going to find what the AI thinks about your AI and what your AI is finding for you and what your summaries and your simulations and what your artificial layer is finding, and then your algorithm, and then whatever you've digitized and put on the internet to define yourself, which is some very minuscule version of reality, which is then related through stories you tell and the experiences and relationships you have, which is interpreted, which is at some point a shared experience. So when we have digital only, when we have online only experiences, we're going through 14 layers of distortion noise. Now, there are ways to do that, and there are ways to do that successfully, and there are ways to make these systems work for us. But we have to remember a few things. One is that the systems are inherently extractive. That it took 35 years, but the people who run and design these systems and run them for profit for their shareholders, that they've realized that there's certain ways to run these systems to get maximum capital extraction, which happens to rely on minimal benefit to the users. That's just how it's built, and that's well documented other places. The other thing we have to realize is that it's only escalating. We crossed the threshold in 2025 that more than 50% of the content on the internet is bot-driven, and it's only going to go up from there. Now, what I would want to do, and what I do in my work, and what and others want to do, is I would want to shrink down the number of layers we're going through. Now you're sitting going, but Nick, you're sharing this with us on YouTube, which is showing up in my feed through an algorithm, which is probably only accessible to me because I read some sort of artificially generated summary of it. You're right. I'm willing to and know how to play over there so that I can earn the right to little by little bring you out of those distortion fields, to bring you into a relationship, to find a referral to you, to help you refer into me. The number one thing I want from you is not to subscribe to my content, although if we have to go that way, let's do it. The number one thing I want from you is a conversation, because then we can save so much time. We can have a 15-minute conversation and save ourselves weeks, months, years, and hours and hours and hours of wasted distortion if we can just have a conversation. So I hope that you will initiate that conversation. If you're not ready for that yet, again, the rest of this content, the rest of this webinar is available at trustmadegrowth.com. You can get it here through the link that we'll have in the notes to this video. But more importantly, put in a comment, send me a note. I want to have a conversation so that we can shrink down the reality distortion fields and actually get to a shared experience and decide how we can help each other build whatever world we're trying to build together. Thanks, everybody.